For those unaware, I've actually covered this topic in a fairly recent video. If you want to check it out, I'll throw up a link in the description. I essentially took all of the mainline Pokemon games and arranged them into a coherent timeline. I was planning on this video to be sort of a small update to include where Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire fit in, because at the time of the last video, nobody knew exactly when they happened. Perhaps the craziest thing about all of this though, is that one small line of dialogue in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire has changed the entire perception of the timeline. Be warned, there will be spoilers about Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's Delta episode in this video, along with some small details from the main story. Let's start with one of the small details I said in my original video. In my first video about the timeline, I made a very clear point that remakes of games will always replace the original games. For example, Heart Gold and Soul Silver replaced the original games of Gold, Silver, and Crystal on the timeline. Nah. Despite all of the logic I had placed into the timeline, I was actually mistaken on this. Let's look for a second at the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire to get more details on why this is no longer the case. During the Delta episode, one of the main characters to the plot, Zinnia, reveals some insane information about the Pokemon universe. Here's some screen caps of what she says, but in short, she says that there are actually multiple Pokemon timelines. One where Mega Evolution is common and exists, and another where Mega Evolution does not exist. This is such a shocking thing for Pokemon to do. Pokemon has usually had a semi-straightforward timeline, and now it's just been confirmed that there are two separate timelines, with possibly more. It is my theory that 3 timelines exist. Zinnia explicitly mentions 2 timelines. One that exists with Mega Evolution, which I'll be calling the Mega Timeline, and one that exists without Mega Evolution, which I'll be calling the Modern Timeline. I also believe that a 3rd timeline exists, but I'll be going into that a little bit later. Let's start off with the Mega Timeline, and let's take a look at all the games that have Mega Evolution in them. There's only X and Y, and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. There's multiple ways to determine where the games go on the Mega Timeline, but perhaps the easiest is to look at a man named Mr. Bonding. In Pokemon X and Y, you meet a mysterious man by the name of Mr. Bonding. Throughout the course of the game, he'll give you O-Powers, which you can use to boost stats for a limited time throughout the game. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, in Mauville City, you meet a variety of different men who give you O-Powers. After a strange turn of events, they all fuse with a random man, which in turn becomes Mr. Bonding. This is an origin story of sorts for him. Thus, we can conclusively say that X and Y comes after Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. We've now placed both of these games into the Mega Timeline appropriately. Unfortunately, there's no way to say how long it is between each game. It could be similar to the other timeline, or it could be completely different. I'm going to place it at about 1 to 3 years between these two games, but once again, we can't say for sure until we get more information. Before I get off of the Mega Timeline and go to the Modern Timeline, I want to quickly discuss the possibility of other regions and games set in this timeline. I think it's pretty obvious, but all future games that include Mega Evolution, i.e. all of them, will now take place in the Mega Timeline. This goes the same for any remakes that they might make, such as Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. If it features Megas, it will go into this timeline. We actually know that the other regions exist in this timeline. Many people throughout Kalos mention Sinnoh and Johto, and in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Aaron mentions that his home region is Unova. One of the big things that proves all of this though is Steven's house in Moss Deep City. There are several stones inside glass cases that all originate from different regions. I'm going to briefly list where all of these come from. Mount Coronet in Sinnoh, Rock Tunnel in Kanto, Mount Mortar from Johto, and Chargestone Cave from Unova. Unless you're related to Steven, you probably fell asleep while I read all of that, and that's fair. Rocks aren't very exciting. There is an important thing to take away from all of this though, and that is that all of the past regions exist in this new mega timeline and have similar, if not identical, geography to the other timelines. This isn't the only hint we get that the two timelines might be similar though. In X and Y, two NPCs have met some pretty interesting people from other regions. One of these trainers claims to have met ORAS, who acts exactly like he did in Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, which is him being obsessed with unlocking the power in Pokemon. The other trainer seems to have had a run-in with Blue, saying that he was in Kalos studying abroad and spouted his signature line, "Smell ya later." So with people and places being almost the same between the two universes, is it possible that the same events happened in each timeline? I believe that the answer is yes, although the events would have happened in a different and altered way. For example, I believe that Blue still set off on a journey against Red in the Mega Timeline. Red would have taken down Team Rocket while Blue would have become the champion. These events would be the same in every timeline, such as how one of the legendary beasts was awakened in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, along with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. What would be different, however, would be how they accomplished it. There might be some small changes here and there, but it's entirely likely that Red and Blue would have both become able to use Mega Evolution and used it in their final battle or against Team Rocket. While in the modern timeline, they wouldn't be able to use Megas because they don't exist. To summarize a little bit of what I just said, I believe that the events of the modern timeline happen in the Mega Timeline, just in an altered way, perhaps involving Mega Evolution. Game Freak has set this up perfectly, because they can now make remakes of Red and Blue, or Diamond and Pearl, or even Black and White, and they can make them fall perfectly into the Mega Timeline without messing up any other timelines. As it stands now, only Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire, Pokemon X, and Pokemon Y are currently in the Mega Timeline. But based on the modern timeline, I think it's a safe bet that the events of the other timelines happen in the Mega Timeline. I've been talking a lot about the modern timeline, but I haven't really addressed what it's all about. Let's change that. Moving away from the Mega Timeline, we come to the second timeline that Zinnia was speaking of. This timeline didn't have the war 3,000 years ago that resulted in Mega Pokemon, so it is completely barren of Mega Stones or Mega Pokemon. Luckily for us, this timeline is surprisingly easy to map out, because it's essentially the timeline I already made in my previous video. This timeline is widely accepted by the community as the definitive timeline. It starts with Fire Red and Leaf Green happening at the same time as Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. 3 years after that, Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum happen, along with Heart Gold and Soul Silver. After those games comes Black and White. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact time span between them, but I'd estimate it at about 2 to 5 years. 2 years after Black and White comes Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. Here's where the timeline might get a little bit messy though. In the last video about the timeline I made, I referred to a tweet made by the game's story producer, who confirmed the whole timeline. He states that X and Y happen at the same time as Black 2 and White 2. This doesn't add up though, as Mega Evolution doesn't exist in this timeline. It's possible that the producer didn't want to tweet something as crazy as split timelines to everybody, or perhaps the X and Y he's referring to is a modified alternate X and Y to what we've seen. The X and Y that we've seen is the one from the Mega Timeline, which features a plot specific to Mega Evolution, along with a really heavy emphasis on Megas. What if the X and Y the producer is referring to is an X and Y that takes place in the modern timeline? Logically, it would have to exist in some way, even without Megas. This is one of the big mysteries of the timeline, and I hope to find an answer to it soon. Until then, I'm going to gray out X and Y on the modern timeline to symbolize that I don't know where the heck it goes, or what's up with it. Aside from all of the X and Y stuff, the modern timeline is very easy to follow and is a really nice looking timeline. Alrighty, let's rewind for a sec. Way at the start of the video, I said that there was a third timeline I was going to cover. I'm no liar when it comes to Pokemon, so here it is. This is the third timeline that I believe exists. The classic timeline. There's no evidence to support this timeline, but because there's the possibility of parallel universes, I'm assuming that there could be more than one other universe. This classic timeline, as I'm calling it, contains the original games in it. Pokemon Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow, along with Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal. It might seem weird to have a separate timeline for games that have remakes, but after Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire having a different timeline than Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, I believe that these would have to be contained in their own universe. The timeline was set very clearly in the games. Gold, Silver, and Crystal come 3 years after the original games. An interesting thing to note about these games is that there's no reference to any other regions in them. There's no Sevi Islands in Red and Blue, so there's no way to know if Hoenn even exists in this timeline. It's also impossible to know if any other alternate versions of future games or regions appear at all in this timeline. For now, we can only assume that these 2 generations are all that consist of this timeline. And with that, I finished Pokemon Timeline 2, Electric Pikachu Boogaloo. In all seriousness though, if I've missed a crucial detail or explained something wrong, please leave a comment so I can get it right and fix it. I'd hate to leave somebody out there with wrong information, especially if it came from me. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.